is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. So opens Pride and Prejudice, establishing marriage's essential role in the novel from the very first page. Austen's most famous text deals with love and attraction. As promised in the title, the novel also discusses prejudice, pride, and the way these two forces can interfere with romance. Intelligent, witty, and fiercely independent, our protagonist, Elizabeth Bennet, offers us a look at the restrictive rules and norms of Regency society and a woman's place in that society. While you read, pay attention to the way the novel reveals these societal expectations, as well as the roles men and women are expected to play. Don't forget, though, to also enjoy Austen's humor, the colorful characters who populate the world of the novel, and the good old-fashioned love story. Without further ado, let's dive into the complicated milieu of Austen's world and Regency England. Jane Austen was born in 1775 and died in 1817 at the age of 41. Jane was the second youngest of 8 children, born to Reverend George Austen and Cassandra Leigh Austen. Her father was a parish leader in the country village of Steventon in southern England's county of Hampshire. Jane and her sister Cassandra were the only girls in the family, but did receive a good education. She and Cassandra were close companions throughout their lives, and neither woman ever married. Jane's brothers had various careers in banking, the clergy, and the aristocracy, but her 2 youngest brothers went into the Navy and eventually became admirals. All of the Austen family was very well read, especially novels, utilizing circulating libraries which were very popular at the time. Jane actually began writing at the age of 12 or 13, and these were mostly pieces designed for the entertainment of her family. In 1795, she and Thomas Lefroy fell in love when he was visiting his aunt and uncle. Unfortunately, his aunt sent him away because she knew he would be cut out of the family if he married a woman with few prospects like Jane. He later became a successful and wealthy lawyer, which would have allowed him to marry Jane as he had his own fortune, but he never returned to claim Jane's hand. After her father retired in 1800, the family moved to Bath, where Austen's writings stalled. Austen is said to have fainted at the news that they would be leaving their country home for the social town of Bath. In 1801, she supposedly found love again with a clergyman, but he died suddenly before he could propose. There are no documents or definitive proof of the existence of this fellow. The brother of her close friends, the Big Sisters, Harris Big Withers, proposed to her later in her life. She accepted his proposal because his fortune would ensure her security from poverty and allow her to live a comfortable life. She accepted because his fortune would ensure her security from poverty and allow her to live a comfortable life. But she rescinded her acceptance the next morning because they were not a good match and did not have similar temperaments. Her father died in 1805, leaving her mother, Cassandra, and Jane without any means of income. Luckily, their brothers were able to pool their resources and provide for the women of the family, allowing them to live comfortably in Bath. Eventually, Austen grew tired of Bath in terms of the setting and the people. The women of the family later moved in with Frank, one of the brothers who was in the Navy. After that, they lived on one of the estates of Edward Austen, who had been adopted by a wealthy branch of the family to be their heir, because that branch of the family had no children of their own. Austen would remain at Chawton Cottage in Kent, where she lived until she died. Austen remained close to her family, and was especially fond of her nieces and nephews, in particular her niece Fanny, who was Edward's daughter. She published her first novel in 1810, rather later in her short life, and published 3 more before she died. So Sense and Sensibility was followed by Pride and Prejudice, which was then followed by Mansfield Park, and then followed by Emma. Her last 2 novels were published after her death by her family, and those include Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. Later in her life, though, she developed symptoms of what was most likely Addison's disease, at least that's what current scholars think, which is a disease of the adrenal glands, where they do not produce the necessary amount of certain hormones, and she died the following year. Her novels fell out of notice until 1833, when they were republished, and they've been mainstays of literature ever since. We know very little about Austen in many ways, as much of her personal papers have not survived, and she was an inherently private person. Her sister Cassandra actually obliterated parts of her letters and may have destroyed other letters in order to protect her sister's privacy and legacy. In general, Austen's work is characterized by wit and parody, which demonstrates critical thought and critical evaluation of the times. And according to Claire Harmon, Austen's work and life were woman-centered, and no aspect of female psychology escaped her. She was not simply ahead of her time and anticipating much of what we would now call the psychology of sex, but she is in many respects ahead of our time too. She became the shaper of the modern novel. Despite similar praise from many other scholars, Austen's legacy has been controversial, with many feminists arguing over whether her books are subversive or conservative. Later female authors like Bronte and Browning disliked Austen, while Woolf, an early feminist, adored her work. Throughout the novel, Mrs. Bennet refers to the entailment that will prevent her daughters from inheriting the estate. Since I am not an expert on old-timey English laws, and I am assuming you guys aren't either, let's go through a quick rundown of what that term means. An entail is also known as a fee-tail. This law was designed to ensure land was not divided up, and it was passed on in its entirety. This was the result of an idea called primogeniture, which meant the eldest son would receive the whole estate. Under an entail, the eldest son could not divide or sell the land he inherited, and younger brothers also could not receive that land, as it could not be subdivided between siblings. Primogeniture was falling out of favor in Austen's time, but cases of it did still exist. Jane Austen is most often associated with the Regency period of literature and history. This time period, though, only occurred from 1811 to 1820 in terms of the strict historical sense. It was so named because this was the period where King George III, the one who featured in the American Revolution, was declared unfit to rule, and his son, George IV, ruled as Prince Regent in his stead. Austen straddles various literary and historical periods, though, not neatly fitting into any that we've established. She's not a Victorianist, as she died before Victoria was even born, and although she was a contemporary of the Romantic writers and the poets, she does not follow all the components of their literary style. She comes after the Austen era, which ended around 1744, which is full of satire and parody, so she's not exactly a member of that period as well, but we do see some of those elements in her work. So many scholars have agreed that the Regency period, which is not a really well-defined period of literature, is the best fit for Austen. And it's important to keep in mind some of the historical context. Later in her life, England and France were engaged in the Napoleonic Wars, and the Navy was even more of a risky business in those days. Men could achieve great fortune or a quick demise just as easily. So although most of Austen's novels depict these comfortable domestic spheres, England was in a state of great turmoil at the time, involved in many conflicts. And the kind of life that Austen lived and wrote about, being successful in the domestic sphere, was really considered the proper place for women at this time. Austen was very secretive about her writing, perhaps because of the difficulty to live a private life once you were a published authoress. She did not use her name when she published Sense and Sensibility, but said it was by a lady, and she continued to leave her name off of her work. Her name was actually never attached to her novels until her brother published Persuasion in Northanger Abbey with her name after her death, and drew the connection to the other novels she had published. Again, during this era, the general public frowned on women being involved in the public sphere, which included being an author, so there was societal pressure to not reveal your name. And at the same time, even though the novel was very popular in Jane Austen's time, it was considered a low form of culture, not very sophisticated, not high class. Also, the novel was often considered a form of women's writing. And again, concurrently with this, literary culture began to become more masculine, and men started to write about a lot of the themes and topics that had been women authors focused before the 1800s. So we kind of seeing men moving back in and reclaiming the novel in some ways. And the Regency Georgian era of Austen's life was characterized by inheritance and property laws that excluded women, putting them at the mercy of male relations or husbands. Married women did not gain rights until after Austen's death. When women married, they turned their fortunes over to their husbands, and a man could prevent his wife from seeing their children if she displeased him. Divorce was almost entirely non-existent and not available to many women. In addition, the risk of dying in childbirth was much more prevalent than today, even though it is still a problem in our country and in other developing nations. So even if you did manage to find a successful and loving match, you may not live to enjoy it. And there was much pressure on women to conform, as women who were disinherited or fell out of favor in society did not have a safety net to turn to. Additionally, spinsters or unmarried women, especially when their fathers and other male relatives died, often had very few resources to turn to and relied on the charity of friends and family. In terms of a more international scope, Britain was becoming increasingly colonial, conquering other nations, and products made from slave labor were also part of the political landscape at the time. So we're seeing Britain rise in its power, but also kind of becoming involved in these complicated and morally questionable domination practices. In addition, in terms of more conflict, the French Revolution, which lasted from 1789 to 1799, had created a large-scale and long-lasting anxiety in Britain, as many feared that a similar uprising of the lower classes and a turning over of the social order may be happening in Britain soon as well. So Austen, again, although she's not directly dealing with these ideas, is writing in a climate with all these anxieties about the French Revolution, about the Napoleonic Wars, about the upcoming Industrial Revolution, which England was on the brink of at the time. So the nation is really changing politically, socially, geographically, and commercially, and Austen is right on the brink of that. So her novels, again, are kind of capturing some of that spirit and sense of a changing England.